All right. As you see, I wanted to have a laser pointer for this one because I'm going to point out quite a few things on my slides. You've already heard from Walker that this one's going to be a little more interactive. I'm probably not going to get through all of my material, so if you have questions during the talk, please feel free to raise your hand, get a microphone to yourself so we can cover it right away. I'm going to try to walk with you through a transaction serialization, the Bitcoin transaction serialization, and we'll try to understand a non-Segwit transaction and then a Segwit transaction to compare it to. And I hope by the end of this talk you understand how the transaction weight is calculated and how the witness discount works. And if we get to it, we may take a look at a few different output types in the end as well. So before Segwit activated, a transaction would look like this. Generally, every transaction has to have at least one input and at least one output. And so you see here, I hope you can see it, but this is a paid to public key hash input with a 1 in the address. And this transaction has 4 outputs. One is a wrapped Segwit, one is a native Segwit, legacy. Doesn't matter too much for now, but yeah, so you've hopefully all seen this before for some of your transactions. And now under the hood, this looks a little more detailed. So if you serialize or look at the serialization of a transaction, here nicely colored by yogg.io, you can see that all of these informations are encoded in a string of hex, and this hex is colored here by the different functions. So I'll walk you through what we're looking at here. At first, we're going to look at the metadata of the transaction. So a transaction has something that I like to call the transaction header. It consists of the version, which is a 4-byte field, the input counter, which tells you how many inputs there will be in the transaction, the output counter, which does the same for outputs, and a log time field, which is also 4 bytes. If anybody has been following the recent announcement of the V3 transactions, this is the TX version field that we're talking about, and this would be a 3. Also, as you can see, for example, here, the 1 is in the front because it's little endian. Damn Satoshi. So, we've looked at the header, and again, if you have any questions, just get my attention and we'll get you a mic. Now we'll look at the inputs. So if we spend a transaction input, the very first thing that we need to do is we have to tell the world which UTXO we're spending. And to uniquely identify a UTXO, what we use is the so-called outpoint. The outpoint consists of a TX ID and the position in the output list of that transaction. So here in this case, there was a transaction. So I just picked this transaction randomly from mempool.space last week. So I don't know whose this is or anything like that. But this TX ID in dark blue up here gives us what the parent transaction of that UTXO was. And this light blue here, all zero, is the position in the output list. As computer scientists, we start counting at 0. So all zeros here, the 8 zeros, are the first output or first entry in the output list. Okay, so now to spend that UTXO, we have to satisfy the condition script that was encoded in that UTXO, and we do that with an input script. So first, because input scripts can have a variable length, depending on what sort of condition script we're trying to satisfy, we have to tell how long the script is. This is this red field here, 6a. I'm not going to calculate in my head right now what that is. I think 106, but yeah. All right. Yes? Okay, thanks. All right, and then the light blue here is the input script. So in this case, for a paid to public key hash input, anybody got guesses what that contains? Yes, Will? No, okay. So we first, to satisfy a pay to public key hash, the funds are locked to the hash of a public key. So we have to show the public key, then hash it and show that it matches what was stored in the output. And then after that, provide a signature that matches the public key. So all of that is in this light blue stuff. And then finally, the last field of the input is the sequence. Does anybody know what we use sequences for? No? Yes, Josie. Yes, for example, we can indicate that a transaction is replaceable if any one input on a transaction is lower than the maximum value. This is the maximum value. The transaction is non-final and can be replaced. That's BIP 125 RBF, right? You only need to specify it on one input. That is sufficient to make the whole transaction non-final. What happens if this field is lower than maximum minus 1? Then we're dealing with lock times. All right. I don't want to dwell too much on that because otherwise we'll not get to other stuff. Let's look at the outputs next. So I hope you can see that here, but oops, sorry. Here we had the output counter from the header before. We have 4 outputs on that transaction, and I've highlighted one of them. There's 3 more underneath. But the first thing that we have in the output is this yellow field, which I've titled amount. This is the number of satoshis that we're signing over to this condition script that we're locking up funds to. So an output creates a new UTXO. A UTXO has a certain number of satoshis that are allocated to it, and then it has a locking script or output script or condition script that codifies the conditions under which this can be spent. Yes, Sahid? The largest amount we can put into a transaction, the amount field is 8 bytes, and I believe that is sufficient to store more than 21 million Bitcoin. Yes. So some people might know already, but we never use floats or doubles or any sort of comma behind comma numbers in all of protocol development. The native unit in all of the protocol is satoshis. So we have here an integer amount of satoshis that we're assigning to an output. We do not have a number of bitcoins or anything like that because floats are bad. Floats make rounding errors and things like that. We don't want that in protocol development where people need to come to the same result, right? So we have an 8-byte field to encode the amount. It's also little endian, as you can see, because this would be a shit ton of Bitcoin otherwise. And then we have an output script here, and the output script is 1.7 long. That is 23. Does anybody know what that is? Well, we can look it up, right? So that was a pay-to-script hash script, right? Yes. So the hash is in pay-to-script hash is 20 bytes. Yeah, it's a hash 160, and well, I'll get to that later. I have a slide on all the different scripts for all the output types if we get there. But so what you see here is an amount, the length of the output script. The output script encodes the rules under which the money can be spent, and then 3 more times because there's 4 outputs on this transaction. All right. I've been told that I should really clarify what native Segwit is. And I guess the slide is a little raw because I made it 10 minutes ago. But so a lot of people refer to the first type of native Segwit outputs just as native Segwit. You might be familiar with pay-to-witness public key hash or pay-to-witness script hash. It's the addresses that start with BC1Q. And those are native Segwit v0, the first or the 0th version of native Segwit outputs. And recently we had a soft fork in November, well, not quite that recently, almost a year ago, which introduced another new output type called pay to taproot. And pay to taproot is also a native Segwit output. And it's the native Segwit v1 output, and these addresses start with BC1P, because Q encodes 0 in bash32 and P encodes 1 in bash32. So all of the native Segwit outputs encode a witness program after a version in the output. And so if I talk about native Segwit output, this applies to all of these, but my example will be a pay to taproot transaction, just to clarify. Any questions on that so far? All right, cool. Yeah? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so wrapped Segwit is a little bit of a hybrid because wrapped Segwit was made to be backward compatible by satisfying the rules of pay to script hash, but the witness part is all the same as with native Segwit. So in the witness section for a wrapped Segwit output, you'll have exactly the same scripts as in, or the same witness stack, I should say, sorry, not scripts, as in native Segwit. But we'll get a little more to that. So the big difference between wrapped and native Segwit is that you have a forwarding script in the input script that says, hey, look at the witness, that's where we actually provide the data to satisfy the spending conditions. Did that explain your question or satisfy your question? Yeah, nested is different, and we're also not doing nested Segwit outputs for pay to taproot, where that was only a v0 thing. Now that people hopefully can build native Segwit outputs, and we will leave that behind us, hopefully. All right, let's look at our second transaction. So I brought to you the very first pay to taproot transaction that was ever spent on the blockchain. You will recognize here that bitbug42 left us an op return message. I like Schnorr6 and cannot lie. And I'm not sure if you can read this, but this is a BC1P address, which indicates that we're spending a pay to taproot output. And it's also sending the change to a taproot output here. So let's look at the serialization of that. Looks very much like our previous example, except that we have a lot more orange in here. And all the orange here is the witness bytes, and we will look at them a little more in detail. And you will see that there's also a few other differences. For example, the input script length here is now 0. And that is because we no longer have an input script on native Segwit inputs. Instead, we provide the data to satisfy the spending conditions in the witness. So all the native Segwit outputs, you can always recognize a native Segwit input on having an input script length of 0. All right, let's look at the witness data. Who remembers what we should have directly after diversion here usually in a non-Segwit transaction? Larry? The number of inputs, exactly. So in the very first sentences I said, a transaction must always have one input at least and one output at least. So if a non-Segwit node, a node that is not familiar with the Segwit format, gets a transaction that has a 0 here, what do you think will he do with that transaction? Well, that's invalid. He drops it and bans his peer for giving him this bullshit, right? So what we put here with the marker and the flag is that hey, this is a new format, and old people shouldn't, like old nodes shouldn't even read this. You got this by accident. Don't parse this. And then the flag indicates this transaction has a witness section. The witness section is inserted after the outputs before the lock time. I saw a question there. Right. Okay. So the question is whether I mean that this transaction appears actually to be invalid for old nodes. And yes, this representation of that transaction appears invalid because non-Segwit nodes, of which there are basically none on the network anymore, because the last client that was non-Segwit was, I think, 0.12, and that is 10 versions ago, so about 5 years ago. And the life cycle is like we maintained them for 2 years. So this is mostly hypothetical, and to explain how that worked back then, not an active problem anymore. But to make, well, actually, can I take your question in like 2 slides, because I'm gonna get to that. But yes, I do mean invalid. If we give this representation of the transaction to a non-Segwit node, they will think that it's crap. Walker, I think Paul has a question or a comment. Sorry.
I was going to maybe try to say that it happens to be the case with Segwit. It's very bizarre that very unique situation where, as I understand it, the old Segwit nodes, if a Segwit node talks to a non-Segwit node, it will construct a completely different like transaction vector and a completely different block and everything, and it will not have any of this invalid type of thing. So there's a one-to-one correspondence. There's an isomorphic correspondence between this transaction and a different transaction that is valid and is a non-Segwit transaction. So the non-valid thing is very confusing. I can understand how anyone would be confused by that because it's very confusing.
I'm going to get more into the details of that and hopefully make it clear by then. There is a different representation of the transaction that the non-Segwit node will be able to parse and will make them achieve the same UTXO set in the long run. They do not get the witness data because they don't understand the witness data. So basically, we're talking a protocol speaking a protocol that they don't understand, and to protect them from getting that, we made it in a way that they will not accept it. All right. So I talked a little bit about marker and flag, which indicate A, this is a Segwit transaction, and B, this transaction has a witness section. Now, why don't we have a count of witness stacks? Well, because every input has to have a witness stack in a Segwit transaction. So by having the input counter, we know how many witness stacks there will be. In this transaction, we had only a single input. So we have a single witness stack to satisfy the input. And the first thing that we have is a number of witness items. And then the length of, in this case, the first witness item and only witness item, which is 40, which is 64, and this makes that a signature. And yes, in a pay-to-taproot TPAF spend, we only have a signature in the witness stack. All right. So this is our first pay-to-taproot input ever. And how does that affect us? Well, before Segwit, we had a block size limit of 1 megabyte. We just counted the raw bytes of all the data in a block, and that had to be smaller than 1 million or up to 1 million, and otherwise the block was invalid. With Segwit, we introduced a new limit for block space. We introduced a weight limit, and the weight limit is 4 million weight units. And since we only give the non-witness data to old nodes, they only see this green part up here, which is always smaller than 1 megabyte. But for people, or nodes I should say, that speak Segwit, we also give them the witness data, so we can exceed the 1 megabyte now. And recently in August, we actually had a new biggest block, which was 2.77 megabytes. So how does that work? What a Segwit node sees is the complete transaction. And I want to clarify at this point, often there was this misunderstanding that the witness is not part of the transaction, or the witness is not part of the block, or things like that. You can see how this orange part down here is very much part of the transaction and before the lock time. And this is the full Segwit transaction. This is what nodes exchange on the network, gossip about, and use to verify that everybody followed all the rules. And for the nodes that don't understand Segwit, what we gave them is the transaction without the witness data. And that should look very familiar, right? There's the version, there's the input counter, we have the out point telling it what UTXO is being spent so that they can delete it from their UTXO set. We have an input script, which happens to be of length 0, and then a sequence. And then we have two outputs with amounts and output scripts, right? And finally, a log time. So all of the parts are exactly the same as before Segwit for non-Segwit nodes. But they have a reduced security model because they can't actually validate the signature, right? They don't see the signature at all. And they don't, we strip out the witness marker and the witness section and just hand them the stripped transaction. And this is A, smaller than the full transaction, which makes us still stick to the 1 megabyte block limit that the old nodes were enforcing and are enforcing. And also, it has this reduced security because they don't actually get the inputs for the condition script to show that somebody actually signed for this. I saw a question or a comment? Aha. How do we have the same TXID between non-Segwit node and Segwit nodes? Well, Segwit introduced another change, which was that we calculate the TXID for Segwit transactions only from the strip transaction. So we use this as the input to calculate the TXID, which is just the hash of the transaction data. And this is also, by the way, what allows us to do things like Lightning. Because in Lightning, we need to build a refund transaction that spends the output here before it is signed, right? You don't want to give the channel partner the funding transaction that is fully signed, because then they could just make sure that the money goes there already. We want to show them the unsigned transaction, but we still need to agree on the TXID so that they can sign the refund transaction to us first before we send the funding transaction and put money at risk, right? So in Segwit transactions, we calculate the TXID from the stripped size, and non-Segwit nodes and Segwit nodes therefore always have the same TXIDs for the same transactions, even though they have different representations and non-Segwit nodes only see part of it. Thanks, that was a great question. Yes? Yes, there's also a witness TXID. So in order to commit to the full transaction that Segwit nodes see, we do have to have an identifier or a commitment to the full complete transaction, right? If we were only hashing to the stripped, if we only committed to the stripped transaction, then somebody could take out the signature, put it in their block, and it would look the same, but would be invalid, and make a block invalid without changing the Merkle root, right? So actually, we use the strip transaction to take the TXID. That's what we commit to in the Merkle root of the block. That's what we can build a child transaction on top of. That's what makes transaction malleability go away, if you've been around and heard about that. But then, but then for the Segwit nodes, to make sure that they actually have the complete transaction, we have also a witness commitment in the Coinbase, which commits to all the witness TXID. And the witness TXIDs are built from the complete transaction. Thank you. You guys, okay, go on.
If you got a transaction with multiple inputs, is there something in the witness data that delineates where that witness for one finishes and the next one starts?
That's an excellent question, and I should have really used a transaction with two inputs, but no, there is not. And how does that work? Well, we have an input counter up here already that tells us how many witness stacks there will be, because every input has to have a witness stack. So if you have a legacy input and a pay-to-taproot input, for example, the legacy input will have a witness stack of length 0. It'll just say, hey, here's my witness stack. I have 0 witness items. Thanks, man. And then the second witness stack will have the pay-to-taproot witness stuff, right? So let's say if we had a pay-to-public key hash input, a legacy input here before, this one would be 2, and we would just expect 2 witness stacks. the first one would say 0 here, and then we'd know, okay, we've completely parsed that witness stack because it's just length 0, 0 items. And then we'd get to the second one, and it tells us again how many witness items to be, then tells us the length of each witness item, gives us the witness item data. Yeah. So we don't really have to tell how many witness items, or sorry, witness stacks there will be. Okay, so we've talked about what a Segwit node sees, what a non-Segwit node sees. So where's that mystical transaction weight coming in from? Well, we take 4 times the non-Segwit data and 1 times the witness data and add that up, and that is the transaction weight. So we know now how we get the strip transaction, right? Just remove all the witness data, and we count each byte of the non-witness data 4 times, and then the witness data is counted once. And now, yes? Why are these 2 coefficients? They were basically arbitrarily picked because they felt good. Yes, sir. Okay. Okay, thanks. So, what happens if we have a transaction that does not have any witness data? We have only non-witness data. We count that 4 times, and we have a limit of 4 million weight units now, and before that we had 1 million bytes. So if we count all the non-witness data 4 times, that is the same size, right? We multiply it by 4, and the limit is 4 times higher. So for non-Segwit transactions, this continues to be backwards compatible and completely correct for old nodes. What happens when we have witness data? Well, old nodes don't see the witness data, and this is strictly less than the proportion of the block weight, the 4 million weight units, is bigger than the non-witness data of 1 million bytes. So whenever we have any Segwit transactions, they will always fit into the strip block, and the strip block will always be less than 1 megabyte. And that's how old nodes that don't understand Segwit could follow along and still arrive at the same UTXO set, because they knew which UTXOs to remove from the set and to create, and would always get a valid block because there was a block that was spending stuff, was creating new outputs, had the same TX IDs, and was backwards compatible. Yo. If there's more questions, let's do questions first. Otherwise, I'll have a look at this table. There, back here. Yeah. Let's do here first, and then we can get a phone, my talking stick to you too.
I don't know, maybe if that is too detailed now, but I heard now the last days there is a proposal to remove the witness discount. I think I even heard it from you on an evening dinner.
Yeah.
So maybe you could elaborate a bit. I think that is interesting for others as well. What is the motivation behind that? Thanks.
So there were some people speculating on whether or not removing the witness discount in the long term would be able to be soft forked in. And the argument that they made was that if you always count all the witness data at the same cost as non-witness data, so if here was also a 4x, that's strictly smaller than the current, it would use less of the available block space than the current rules, so we could soft fork that in. And what that would do is, if we had a cross-input signature aggregation, aka when we can have transactions where we have multiple inputs but only one signature, then that would make it more attractive to use aggregation, because it would remove more cost from the transaction. And it would also decrease the block space, the available block space, which some people find good because we apparently have too much block space already. I do not subscribe to that. I thought hypothetical scenario, maybe when we do a cross-input signature aggregation proposal, that would actually be attractive to economically incentivize adoption, but I think it's pretty speculative and far out there still. Question back there? Yeah.
The legacy signatures are not discounted, right?
Legacy signatures are counted as non-witness data. They're in the input script. Let's remind ourselves, just a sec. Here. So a non-Segwit transaction has to provide the witness data, so to speak, the script arguments to satisfy the condition script are provided in the input script. So this is a pay-to-public key hash input, and what it does is it provides a pub key and a signature, and then with the output script duplicates the pub key, hashes it, checks that that matches the hash that was in the previous output, and then checks whether the signature fits the pub key. And the pub key and signature are in the input script here, so they're non-witness data and counted for X.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Walker, should I wrap up or one more question? All right.
Why are you not discussing the most important feature of the witness discount, which is that it produces many bad incentives? Certain transactions are larger and consume more bytes, and yet they are undercharged on fees, and yet there's a rampant misconception. When I saw the title of your talk, I thought you were going to talk about the rampant misconception that these transactions are somehow smaller or more efficiently encoded, when the reverse is the truth. Most important thing that you were supposed to say in this whole talk, and I've been waiting patiently for you to get to that slide.
Fine, I'll go to the next slide, which I have right here. Segwit is a block size increase in that it allows to have more data in the block, but it is also sort of a it doesn't really make transactions smaller, at least not for wrapped Segwit. Wrapped Segwit transactions. So in this table, what you see is pay-to-public key hash, which is just legacy single sig, pay-to-script hash, pay-to-witness public key hash, which is wrapped Segwit single sig, native Segwit single sig, and pay-to-taproot, right? So for the transaction header, those are the same, except for the lower three, since they require Segwit transactions, we need to have the marker and the flag, right? We talked about that. And output-wise, this is all non-witness data, right? The outputs are never discounted, only script arguments are discounted in the witness section. So you will see, for example, that pay-to-taproot has the biggest output of those four types, right? On the input, however, with the forwarding script that you need to wrap the pay-to-script hash, pay-to-witness public key hash input, basically, in the input script, you just have a redirect that says, hey, I look like a pay-to-script hash output, but really you want to look at the witness section. And that costs us an actual 30-byte increase. 32, I think, or someone. Is Andy here? No. Okay. Anyway, there's like, I can probably, oh yeah, 24 bytes, sorry. Yeah. And so in the raw byte length, actually, the pay-to-public key hash input is, or a transaction with two inputs and two outputs of pay-to-public key hash, which is the legacy type, is basically the same size as a native Segwit v0 single sig input. They are not significantly smaller, but in the amount of block space that they consume due to the discount, the native Segwit is 68 vbytes, where the pay-to-public key hash input is 148. So it's almost twice as big, right? Pay-to-taproot is actually, though, the smallest byte size out of these. Altogether, it's only 312, so it's a solid 20% smaller than native Segwit and pay-to-public key hash. So I agree in parts. For the older Segwit types, they are not a bandwidth improvement. Pay-to-taproot is actually smaller. All right, I think that's all the time I got, and Thank you for coming to my talk.